Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the Appalachian Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in. The weather in Harlan County, Kentucky, had turned bitterly cold on the 17th of November, 1927. Frost covered the windows of every house in Millerton, a mining town that only existed because of the coal seam that ran beneath the mountains around it. It was here that the first reports came out about the strange behavior of Veronica Burke, a woman whose name would later be written down in local records as the subject of one of the most disturbing investigations ever done in the Appalachian region. Veronica Burke did not grow up in Millerton. She came from Richmond, Virginia, in the spring of 1926, after her husband, Augustus Burke, died. He was a wealthy businessman whose wealth had allowed her to buy the biggest house in town, a Victorian building on Whistler's Hill that looked out over the whole mining community. The mining company's superintendent used to own the house, but he left after the violent labor disputes the year before. People in the area had mixed feelings about the property. Some admired it, while others were suspicious of it because it represented the economic divide in Millerton between those who made money from coal and those who risked their lives to get it. What made Veronica's arrival stand out was that she came by herself. No family, no staff, just her, and a few trunks of her things. In those days, it was unusual for a wealthy woman to travel alone, which led to a lot of talk, but her beauty silenced most of her critics. Veronica was 39 and had a striking look. Her raven hair was styled in a sleek bob that framed her face, which had high cheekbones and piercing gray eyes. She wore stylish clothes, which was very different from what the local women wore, which was more practical. The house on Whistler's Hill had fallen apart while it was empty for a few months. According to Jasper Holbrook's personal journal, the owner of Millerton's general store, Veronica hired local men to fix it up and paid them well. He wrote, "Mrs. Burke has been very generous with her late husband's money. Her hired men have been able to pay their bills and then some. If only there were more like her who were willing to share their money in these hard times." For a few months, people were interested in Veronica Burke, but didn't know much else. She mostly stayed to herself and only went into town to get supplies from the general store or hire people to work on different projects around her property. Some people thought she was distant, while others said she was just shy. Local newspapers say that the women in town were both jealous and suspicious of her. In October 1927, everything changed when Millerton's mining company cut wages for the third time that year. Men who had just barely been able to make ends meet suddenly couldn't feed their families. Many people left the town completely to look for work elsewhere. People who stayed behind became more and more desperate. Veronica Burke started acting in a way that would make her famous during this time of economic trouble. Several people say that she started inviting certain men from town to her home on Whistler's Hill. The invitations were hand-delivered, usually when the men's wives were busy doing something else. Matthias Gantry, a foreman at the mine who had just lost his job because of budget cuts, was the first person to get such an invitation. Later, his wife, Esther Gantry, talked to the county sheriff's office investigators about what happened. "He had a weird look in his eyes when he came home that night," she said. Mrs. Burke had asked him to dinner at her house to talk about a possible job. "I didn't like it. No decent woman invites a married man to dinner alone. But we really needed the money." On October 12th, Matthias Gantry got to the house on Whistler's Hill at exactly 7. A letter found among his things after he went missing says that Veronica greeted him in an evening gown that would have been more appropriate for a fancy New York City event than a dinner in rural Kentucky. The house changed. He wrote, "There were candles everywhere, a table set with fine china, and crystal glasses filled with wine. She smiled at me in a way that no other woman had smiled at me before, as if she could see something in me that no one else could. She said she had been watching me and that she knew I was different from the other people in town, more ambitious and more deserving." Matthias's letter said that the dinner was fancy, with several courses of food that Millerton didn't have. Veronica asked him a lot of questions about his life, his goals, and what made him angry. She paid close attention and filled his wine glass whenever it was empty. As the night went on, she started to talk about her dead husband and the money he had left her. She told me she was lonely, Matthias wrote. The house was too big for just one person. She said she needed a man to help her run her business, someone she could trust. When he talked about his wife, her face changed for a moment. Something cold passed through her eyes, but then she smiled and said, "We could make plans for Esther, too. If I proved myself worthy, there would be room for both of us." Matthias's letter doesn't say what happened next because the last few pages were damaged by what looked like water stains. His wife says that he came home well after midnight and he was very excited. "He didn't tell me much about the evening," Esther later told investigators. "He just said that Mrs. Burke had offered him a job managing her household and investments. The pay was more than he'd ever made at the mine. When she asked why she would trust him with such a big job when she barely knew him, he got defensive. Should have been thankful instead of suspicious." 3 days later, Matthias Gantry came back to the house on Whistler's Hill. Esther said he packed his best suit and a small bag of personal things. He said Mrs. Burke needed him to help catalog some of her late husband's business holdings and that it might require him to stay overnight in the study. "I didn't believe him, but what could I do?" He said this was our chance to escape poverty. Matthias Gantry never returned home. A week later, when Esther went to the police, they went to Veronica Burke's house. She welcomed them into the parlor, where she was calm and explained that yes, she had hired Mr. Gantry for some business matters, but he had left a few days earlier, saying something about looking for better opportunities in Charleston. She was surprised that he hadn't told his wife about his plans. The police believed Veronica's story because they didn't find any evidence of foul play and knew that she was well liked in her community. In the past few months, a lot of men had left Millerton to find work elsewhere. Some didn't tell their families because they were ashamed or wanted a new start. 3 more men from Millerton were invited to the house on Whistler's Hill over the next month. They were Samuel Warren, a carpenter who had done some work for Veronica, Tobias Fletcher, the town's only banker, and Donovan Pierce, a younger man who worked as a clerk in the mining company's office. After their second or third visit to Veronica's house, all 3 of them went missing. All 3 had told their families something similar, that Mrs. Burke had offered them jobs managing her business. There were a lot of rumors going around in the town by the middle of November. Some people thought the men had just left their families because they were drawn to Veronica's beauty and wealth. Some people whispered darker theories, saying that she had something to do with their disappearances. When the sheriff finally decided to look into the matter more closely, the mining company executives put pressure on him to keep it quiet because they were afraid that a scandal would make the already unstable economy even worse. Veronica was known to be in town, so 2 deputies were sent to look for her at the house on Whistler's Hill. There were official reports about what they found in the attic, but the public didn't know about them for almost 40 years. A court clerk found the sealed file in 1965 while transferring county records to microfilm. The clerk was upset by what they found and told a local historian about it. The deputy's report said that the attic of the house had been turned into a chamber unlike anything we have encountered in our years of service. Heavy curtains hanging from the rafters divided the space into sections. There was a table in the first section with journals, pictures, and personal items from each of the missing men on it. The journals had entries that started out normal but got more and more disturbing as time went on. Matthias Gantry's last entry said, "She says, I'm almost ready. Soon I'll understand what she saw in me from the beginning. The others don't matter anymore. All that matters is proving myself to her." The deputies found what they called instruments of restraint behind the next curtain. These were handcuffs, ropes, and other things that were tied to the support beams in the attic. The wooden floor below them was covered in dark stains. The third section of the attic contained a collection of glass jars and bottles, carefully labeled and arranged on shelves built into the walls. The deputies didn't go into detail about what was in these containers in their official report. They only said that they had left the scene right away to report their findings, and that the contents were of such a nature as to suggest severe mental disturbance and probable criminal activity. Before a proper investigation could be organized, a fire broke out at the house on Whistler's Hill. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the structure was engulfed in flames. The building and its contents could not be saved because of the extreme heat. After the flames subsided, investigators combing through the ruins found no human remains. Veronica Burke had vanished. The official explanation given to the public was that the men had left town seeking employment, and that Mrs. Burke, despondent over recent investment losses, had likely taken her own life in the fire. The case was considered closed. For the next several years, life in Millerton returned to a semblance of normalcy. The mine eventually closed during the economic collapse of 1929, and the town slowly emptied as families sought opportunities elsewhere. The story might have ended there, consigned to the dusty archives of forgotten county records, had it not been for a series of similar disappearances that began in a small mining community in West Virginia in 1934. Once again, men vanished after becoming acquainted with an elegant widow who had recently arrived in town. Once again, the widow disappeared before authorities could question her. And once again, the pattern repeated, this time in a textile mill town in North Carolina in 1937. The woman used a different name in each place, but her descriptions were very similar. She had black hair, gray eyes, good manners, and a lot of money that she couldn't explain where it came from. In each case, the disappearances ended when authorities began to investigate, and the woman vanished without a trace. The most disturbing connection between these cases emerged in 1938 when a doctor in Virginia was called to treat a drifter who had collapsed from exposure. Among the man's few possessions was a journal containing entries that matched the handwriting of Samuel Warren, one of the men who had disappeared from Millerton in 1927. The final pages described how he had escaped the attic after witnessing what happened to the others, but feared he would never truly be free of her influence. She has ways of changing people. The journal read, of opening doors inside your mind that should remain closed. I see her in my dream still, standing at the foot of my bed, holding that silver key she always wore around her neck. She tells me I'm still hers, that the attic is wherever she is, and that one day I'll return to it willingly. The drifter died before he could be properly questioned, and the journal disappeared from the doctor's office the following night. The doctor reported the incident to local authorities, but without the journal as evidence, his account was dismissed as the ramblings of an overworked country physician. In the years that followed, reports surfaced across the Appalachian region of a woman matching Veronica Burke's description. She appeared in small communities during times of economic hardship, always alone, always wealthy, always taking an interest in specific men who subsequently vanished. By 1945, these reports were so common that a federal investigator named Harrison Puett started to collect them. He made a file that showed a pattern of disappearances in 5 states. Puett's investigation led him to the microfilmed records of the original Millerton case in 1947. After reading the deputy's reports, he went to what was left of the town. By then, it was mostly just a bunch of old buildings that the forest was taking back. The base of the house on Whistler's Hill could still be seen, but it was covered in weeds and young trees. Puett's notes say that he spent a few days digging up the remains of the house's cellar. He wrote about what he found in his personal journal instead of his official report. He said he did this because his findings were so unlikely that they would probably end the investigation and maybe even his career. He wrote, I found a second level beneath the collapsed floor of the cellar that wasn't shown on any of the original house plans. The space had a table, chair, and bookshelves, all of which were remarkably well preserved despite the fire that had destroyed the house above. The books were mostly medical texts, journals of psychological research, and several handwritten volumes in a language I couldn't identify. Puett also found a small silver key on a chain that matched the description in Samuel Warren's journal. His note said that the key opened a metal box that was hidden in the wall of the secret room. The box's contents were only described as photographic evidence of procedures conducted in the attic of such a disturbing nature that I have secured them separately. In 1948, the federal investigation was officially closed. The report said that there wasn't enough evidence to prove that federal crimes had been committed and that the disappearances were probably caused by people moving for economic reasons, which was common at the time. Puett asked to be moved to a different job soon after that and quit working for the government the next year. In 1953, he died in a car accident when his car inexplicably went off a mountain road in western Virginia. If Puett's nephew hadn't found his uncle's personal things in 1968, The Veronica Burke case might have stayed hidden. One of them was a manuscript called The Millerton Horror, a study in systematic corruption. It talked about not only what he found in the ruins of the house on Whistler's Hill, but also a theory about what really happened there. Puett said that Veronica Burke was not just a predatory widow who took advantage of men who were desperate. His investigation found evidence that she was doing some kind of psychological research, using methods that Puett thought she had learned from her late husband, who had supposedly been involved in experimental psychiatric research before he died. Puett wrote, "The attic served as both laboratory and theater. The men were not just victims, they were turned into willing participants through a process of psychological deconstruction and reconstruction. The journals found at the scene show this process from the subject's point of view, starting with flattery and offers of financial security, moving on to isolation from previous social connections, and finally, experiences meant to break down established patterns of thought and behavior." The most upsetting thing about Puett's manuscript was that he said Veronica Burke's disappearances were not escapes, but relocations. He said that she purposely changed her identity and location after getting enough information from each group of subjects. He thought that she was getting better at her skills with each new version, working towards some bigger goal that the evidence didn't make clear. He was even more worried because he thought she wasn't working alone. In every place, he wrote, Veronica Burke, or whatever her real name is, made connections with local power structures like businessmen, law enforcement, and government officials. These connections protected her activities and gave her access to possible subjects. The pattern is too consistent to be a coincidence. Puett's nephew, who was upset by what the manuscript said, called a former FBI agent who had worked with his uncle. This led to a short reopening of the investigation in 1969. But once again, official channels decided that there wasn't enough evidence to continue looking into the matter. The manuscript was put away, and the case faded into the background. Over the next few decades, small towns in the Appalachian region would sometimes report seeing beautiful, single women who came during times of economic trouble, bought big houses, and became interested in certain men who then disappeared. People often thought these reports were just urban legends based on the original Veronica Burke case, which had become a sort of regional folktale. In 1965, a graduate student named Margaret Thorne started looking into what she called patterns of predation in economically depressed communities for her sociology doctoral dissertation. Thorne grew up in eastern Kentucky and heard different versions of the Veronica Burke story as a child. At first, she was skeptical, but she used the topic as an example of how economic worry shows up in regional folklore. But as Thorne's research went on, she became more and more sure that the stories were more than just legends. She followed police reports, newspaper articles, and local histories in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. She found what looked like a pattern of behavior that lasted for almost 40 years. In her dissertation, she said, "What emerges is not a single predator, but a methodology, a system for identifying vulnerable communities and extracting something from them. Whether this represents the work of a single individual or a succession of imitators remains unclear. What is clear is that the pattern persisted too long and appeared in too many locations to be dismissed as coincidence or folklore." Thorne's research led her to a surprising idea, that the different women who were called Veronica Burke over the years may not have been the same person physically, but rather people who were trained in the same skills and were working toward the same goals. She pointed out that the descriptions of the women were similar but not exactly the same, which made her think that different people were taking on the same persona instead of one person getting older naturally over time. Thorne was most disturbed by the fact that each case seemed to have a common symbol, a stylized drawing of a key that was found in personal items left behind, scratched into surfaces, or described by witnesses. This key, like the silver one Puett found in the ruins of the Millerton house, made Thorne think of a shared methodology or affiliation. As Thorne was finishing her dissertation in October 1968, she went to what was left of Millerton to look at the site of the original house on Whistler's Hill. The last entry in her research journal said that she planned to dig deeper into the cellar where Puett had found things. She went to a motel in the nearest town, which was 10 miles from the abandoned mining community, and was never seen again. 3 days later, Her car was found near the Millerton site. There was no sign of Thorne herself in the area that was searched. Her research materials, which included her dissertation that was almost done, disappeared with her. The official investigation found that she probably fell into one of the many abandoned mine shafts in the area. Her body couldn't be found because the lower levels of the mines were flooded. Dr. Victor Reynolds, Thorne's academic advisor, didn't like this answer. He had read drafts of her dissertation and was sure that she had found something important. He paid for a private investigator to look into both Thorne's disappearance and the bigger picture she had seen. Raymond Foster, a former police detective, was the investigator who spent 6 months following the trail Thorne had left behind. In April 1969, he sent Reynolds his last report, which has never been fully published, but parts of it have been used in different academic papers about the case. "I have come to the conclusion," Foster wrote, "that Dr. Thorne was right in her assessment, that the Veronica Burke incidents are not the work of one person, but rather a systematic method. Furthermore, I believe that this method has changed over time to fit new social conditions while still serving its original purpose." Foster's investigation uncovered a troubling possibility, that the individuals targeted in these operations were not chosen at random, but rather selected based on particular psychological or physiological traits. He said that in each case, the men who went missing were described by their communities as being special in some way, like being very smart, very talented, or having a skill or quality that made them stand out. He also found out that in some cases, men who were thought to have left their families or died had reappeared years later in faraway places, working in jobs that required skills they didn't have before. When these men were asked about the years that had passed and any encounters with a woman who looked like Veronica Burke, they said they didn't remember anything. Medical exams of 2 of these people showed strange scars on their scalps that were hidden by their hair. The most frightening part of Foster's report was when he said that whatever had started in Millerton in 1927 had not ended, but had instead changed into something more advanced and harder to find. He wrote, "The pattern becomes less visible over time, not because the activity has stopped, but because it has become more refined. The modern manifestations would not be recognized as connected to the original case, except by someone specifically looking for the pattern." Foster's investigation came to an abrupt end in September 1969 when he was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. He lost all of his notes and files on the case, leaving only the incomplete report he had already sent to Reynolds. The investigation into the Veronica Burke case and its possible modern-day versions was stopped once more. In the months after Foster's death, Reynolds himself became more and more paranoid. His co-workers said that he started working strange hours, locking his office with several locks, and saying he was afraid of being followed. In December 1969, he took an unexpected break from his job at the university and moved to a cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Reynolds kept gathering information about what he now called the Attic Protocol from this remote location. This was his name for the method he thought Veronica Burke had come up with. He talked to the families of men who had gone missing in similar situations, looked through local archives for patterns of disappearances during times of economic trouble, and kept in touch with a small group of researchers who were also interested in the case. Reynolds wrote in his last letter to a co-worker on the 15th of March, 1970, "I am now convinced that what began in that attic in Millerton was never about the suffering or disappearance of individuals, but about what could be extracted from them under specific conditions of isolation and psychological pressure. The attic was not merely a place of confinement, but a specialized environment designed to access something within its occupants, something that could be harvested." After sending this letter, no one ever heard from Reynolds again. When the police finally looked into his cabin in May 1970, they found it spotless and well-organized, with no signs of a fight or forced entry. His research materials were missing, and his files were empty. The official report said that he probably had a mental breakdown because he was so obsessed with the case and stopped doing his research. The Veronica Burke case lost interest in the academic world for almost 20 years after Reynolds went missing. Some paranormal or true crime magazines wrote about it from time to time, but they usually focused on the more shocking parts of the story without adding any new information or insights. Then, in 1987, Howard Mercer, a journalist, started looking into writing a book About missing people in the Appalachian region. Mercer grew up in West Virginia and remembered hearing stories like the one about Veronica Burke when he was a kid. At first, he was only interested in the story because he thought it could be a great mix of historical mystery and regional folklore. Mercer, on the other hand, became more and more sure that the pattern found by Thorne and Reynolds was real and might still be happening. He identified contemporary instances of the same methodology. Cases where economically disadvantaged communities faced clusters of disappearances, preceded by the emergence of a solitary, affluent woman. Mercer's research took him to a small town in western Virginia, where he heard that several men had gone missing over the past 2 years after getting involved with a new widow who had moved to the area and bought the biggest house in town, which was on a hill overlooking the community. Mercer took steps to protect himself because he knew what had happened to other investigators. He shared his research with several coworkers, set up regular meetings with his editor, and brought a hidden recording device with him when he went to the Virginia community. None of these steps worked. Mercer went missing 3 days after he got to town. People found his rental car left on a forest road outside of town. There was no sign of trouble in his hotel room, but his research materials were gone. The sheriff in the area looked for Mercer but couldn't find him. In the end, the case was ruled to be just another sad accident in the Appalachian Mountains' dangerous terrain. 2 weeks after Mercer went missing, his editor got a package with just one audio cassette in it. The recording, which was confirmed to be Mercer's voice, had just under 5 minutes of content. There was a lot of static and background noise, but I could make out a few phrases. Found the house. Hill, just like the others. She calls it something else, but it's the same. Asked about the attic. Her eyes changed when I mentioned it. There's a door in the back of the wardrobe, leads to stairs. I can hear something moving above me. Going to investigate tonight. Key around her neck. Same symbol Thorne described. She knows, I know. The recording ended with what sounded like footsteps coming closer, a door opening, and Mercer greeting someone before the tape cut off. The FBI looked into it for a short time but decided there wasn't enough evidence to prove that a federal crime had taken place. The case was closed again. Since Mercer went missing, the Veronica Burke case has become a footnote in criminology books, often used as an example of how economic problems can lead to local myths and conspiracy theories. When talking about unsolved historical disappearances or the folklore of the Appalachian region, academic papers sometimes mention it, but serious investigations have mostly stopped. And yet, stories live on in small towns all over the Appalachian Mountains. Rumors about beautiful, lonely women who show up when times are tough. Women who buy big houses on hills that look down on towns that are having a hard time. Women who are interested in certain men who then disappear. The most disturbing thing is when men come back after being gone for a long time and their families can't quite explain how they've changed. Men who can't remember where they've been or what happened to them. Men who sometimes wake up in the middle of the night screaming about an attic and what goes on there. The most recent known case related to this pattern happened in 1,968 Inches, a small coal mining town in eastern Kentucky. 3 men went missing over the course of 6 months, each after getting to know a widow who had just moved to town and bought the house of the former mine manager on the outskirts of town. When the police finally went to talk to her, they found the house empty, spotless, and with no sign of the woman or the missing men. Since then, there have been no official investigations or federal funds set aside to see if these different cases might be linked by more than chance and folklore. The file on Veronica Burke and the missing people from Millerton is still in the archives. True crime fans sometimes look at it, but police mostly forget about it. That could be how it was meant to be. It is possible that the method that started in that attic in 1927 has changed so much that it no longer leaves traces that people who aren't looking for them can see. Maybe it still goes on today in places where people are struggling financially, like big houses on hills where attics hold secrets that few people find and even fewer live to tell. Or maybe it's just a legend, a story that changes and spreads because it says something true about how weak some groups are and how predators might take advantage of that weakness. Maybe Veronica Burke was just a troubled woman who did terrible things in that house on Whistler's Hill, and everything that happened after that was just a coincidence and stories that grew out of the original horror. 4 men went missing from Millerton in the fall of 1927, and a fire destroyed the house on Whistler's Hill before a proper investigation could be done. Veronica Burke also vanished without a trace. In the years since, researchers who have looked too deeply into the case have also vanished, taking their work with them. In 1947, the federal building in Charleston, West Virginia, recorded the silver key that Puett found in the ruins of the Millerton house as evidence. Inventory records show that it stayed there until 1969, when it was marked as missing and thought to have been lost during the reorganization of the archives. Like many other things related to this case, its current location is unknown. For people who live in the Appalachian region, especially in small towns that depend on dyeing industries, the legend is both a warning and an explanation. It helps them understand the strange disappearances that happen from time to time, in places where people are desperate for money and are open to promises of opportunity and escape. And for those who have met the elegant women who sometimes live in these communities, who have seen the silver key they wear around their necks, who have been invited to visit big houses on hills and shown the stairs that lead to attics, the story of Veronica Burke is not a legend, but a horror that still echoes through the mountains, as real and present as the darkness that falls over isolated valleys when the sun sets behind the ridgelines. One thing that still bothers me about the Millerton case is the kind of relationship Veronica Burke had with each of the men who went missing. The fragments of journals found in the attic show that she didn't use simple seduction or money to get what she wanted. Instead, she used a complicated method of psychological manipulation that turned her victims from independent people into willing participants in whatever she did in that attic. Puett's manuscript contains excerpts from Matthias Gantry's journal that show how this manipulation worked. At first, I thought she was just lonely and needed company and help. But now I see that she saw something in me from the start, a potential that I didn't even know I had. She talks about transformation, becoming more than human, and going beyond the limits of the flesh. I thought these were just philosophical thoughts, but now I have seen the evidence in her laboratory, the specimens, the documentation, and the results. The mention of specimens and a laboratory suggests that Veronica Burke's activities in the attic went beyond psychological manipulation and into some kind of physiological experimentation. This is in line with what Foster found: strange scars on the heads of men who came back years after they went missing and had no memory of what happened in the meantime. The Veronica Burke case is especially troubling because it suggests that the people who went missing or were experimented on were part of a larger, organized effort that went on long after she disappeared from Millerton. The pattern of sophisticated, solitary women showing up in poor neighborhoods, going after certain men with certain traits, and then disappearing when the police started looking into it, suggests that there is a method to the madness instead of just one disturbed person acting alone. Researchers of the case have been wondering for decades what the point of these actions was. What were the men in those attics getting? And who or what group might be behind a pattern of behavior that has lasted, in different forms, for more than 40 years? Reynolds's theory, which he wrote about in letters to coworkers before he disappeared, was that the Veronica Burke methodology was an attempt to get to and bring out something he called the hidden potential, skills or traits that some people have but don't use in everyday life. He wrote, "The attic creates conditions of isolation, disorientation, and psychological pressure that seem to activate dormant neural pathways. The subject's journals say that the process was painful at first, but eventually changed them. They talk about seeing beyond the veil, understanding things that can't be put into words, and becoming more than they were." This theory could clarify the frequent characterization of the missing men by their communities as having exceptional attributes or skills. They weren't chosen at random. They were chosen because they showed signs of the hidden potential that Veronica Burke and her possible associates wanted to find and use. It could also explain why some men came back years later, working in jobs that required special skills they hadn't had before, with no memory of the time that had passed. They had been changed by the attic protocol, which woke up their dormant abilities and maybe even took advantage of them in some way before they were let back into society. Foster's report suggests the most disturbing possibility: that the method that started in Millerton in 1927 was not the strange behavior of a disturbed person, but the first steps in a systematic process that has been improved and grown over the years. What looked rough and horrible in that attic on Whistler's Hill has changed into something more refined and harder to find, but it's still just as bad for the people who have to deal with it. Foster said that in the cases he looked into from the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, there was no physical evidence of restraint in the original Millerton attic. Instead, the men who went missing seemed to have done so willingly, going back to the houses on the hills night after night and becoming more and more disconnected from their old lives and relationships. He wrote, "The methodology has changed from physical restraint to psychological conditioning, so effective that the subjects become willing participants in their own transformation. This change over time may be why it's harder to see and connect more recent examples of the pattern to the original case." Millerton's crude physical methods have been replaced by more subtle psychological techniques, and the obvious signs of experimentation have been replaced by processes that leave fewer visible traces. But if Foster's theory is right, the main goal stays the same: to find, isolate, and change people with certain traits or potential for reasons that aren't clear but are thought to be important enough to warrant decades of work in many states. The silver key, which is a common thread in all of the cases, from the one found in the ruins of the Millerton house to the similar keys that the women wore in later cases, suggests a common method or connection. Thorne's research showed that the key was not just for looks. It was also a symbol of access to something hidden that could only be reached in certain ways and under certain conditions. She wrote, "The key comes up again and again in the stories of people who met these women. It is always described in the same way: silver, ornate, and worn on a chain around the neck." In some stories, witnesses say they saw the women touch the key while talking to their targets, as if they were activating something with the gesture. This detail has been the same for decades and across large distances, so it can't be a coincidence. It is still not clear what the key stands for or what it does. Puig's manuscript hinted that it might be linked to the opening of doors mentioned in the journals found in the Millerton attic. These doors weren't physical ones, but mental ones, ways to access parts of consciousness or ability that are usually out of reach. In his letters, Reynolds built on this idea by saying that the key was not only a way to get in, but also a way to control. The ability to open and close these psychological doorways at will, to guide the subject through the process of change, and to hold or direct whatever comes out of that process. The latest research into the pattern that Thorne found and that Reynolds, Foster, and Mercer have been looking into has focused on whether the method is still being used today, and if so, what it might look like now. The economy of the Appalachian region has changed a lot since 1927, but many towns still have the same problems and weaknesses that Millerton did when Veronica Burke moved there. Reports keep coming in from these kinds of communities. They talk about wealthy newcomers who live alone and buy big houses on hills. These newcomers are interested in certain local people and keep their activities private in strange ways. Authorities usually ignore these reports, saying they are just paranoia or old stories that keep coming back. But for those who know the history, they are troubling proof that what started in that attic in Millerton may still be going on. Alexandra Holt, a journalist, did the most recent credible investigation into this ongoing pattern. In 2003, she started looking into what she called extraction methodologies in vulnerable populations for a book about predatory behavior in areas with low incomes. Holt's research took her to the historical accounts of the Veronica Burke case and the investigations that followed by Thorne, Reynolds, Foster, and Mercer. Holt was very careful when she looked into the pattern, unlike her predecessors, who had gotten into trouble for going too far. She did her research without anyone knowing who she was, using fake names and middlemen to get information. Instead of publishing her results for everyone to see, she only shared them with a small group of trusted coworkers. One of these colleagues, who asked not to be named, said that Holt found proof that the methodology had continued to change and had become part of more traditional structures and institutions. The coworker said that she thought that what started out as the separate actions of people like Veronica Burke had grown into something bigger and more organized over time, that the attics were no longer in private homes on hills, but in places that looked like they had more legitimate purposes. Holt's research prompted her to examine a private research institution in Western Virginia, founded in the 1992 as a Center for Behavioral Health and Cognitive Sciences. Her notes said that the facility was in a poor area and that the staff included several women who fit the general description of the historical pattern. They were elegant, alone, had unexplained wealth, and had ties to powerful people in business and government. The facility's stated purpose was to study and treat various cognitive and psychological disorders, but Holt's investigation suggested that its actual activities might include identifying and recruiting individuals with specific qualities or potential, particularly from the surrounding economically vulnerable community. Before she could finish her investigation, Holt left public life and told her coworkers that she had taken a job with a research institution in another country. Communications with her ceased abruptly in 2005, and attempts to locate her through the institution she had supposedly joined revealed that no such position had ever been offered or accepted. Her research materials, like those of the investigators before her, disappeared. Her coworkers were worried about her sudden silence and called the police, but the investigation found that she had probably chosen to cut ties with her past and start a new life for personal reasons. This conclusion was very familiar to those who had seen the pattern before. The facility that Holt had been looking into stayed open for a few years after she went missing, but it suddenly closed in 2009 because it couldn't get enough money. The building is still empty, and only the people who worked there know what it was used for and what it did while it was open. For T, few researchers who are still looking into the pattern that Thorne found and Reynolds, Foster, Mercer, and Holt followed. The question is still, what started in that attic in Millerton in 1927, and what does it look like now? Has the method changed so much that it no longer looks like it is related to the original case? Has it been integrated into legitimate-appearing institutions and structures, hiding in plain sight? Or has it indeed ended, the pattern broken, the methodology abandoned as its originators aged and died, leaving behind only the regional folklore and the persistent questions that have haunted the Appalachian Mountains for nearly a century? What is still certain is that the original Millerton case is one of the most disturbing examples of predation on vulnerable communities in American history. 4 men went missing from that small mining town in the fall of 1927 after getting involved with Veronica Burke. The house on Whistler's Hill had an attic where something terrible happened, and those who have tried too hard to find out what happened there have also disappeared, taking their research with them. The warning is clear for those who are still looking into the case. If you look too closely at the attic, you might end up inside it. If you ask too many questions about the silver key, you might find out what doors it opens. If you follow the pattern too closely, you might become part of it. The attic is waiting. The key works. And somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, the methodology continues, evolving, adapting, but maintaining its essential nature, the identification, isolation, and transformation of those with the potential to become something more than they are, for purposes that remain as obscure and as disturbing as the dark corners of that original attic on Whistler's Hill. A researcher at the University of Virginia found a bunch of old photos in the archives of a psychiatric hospital that closed in the 1982nd. This is the most recent news about the Veronica Burke case. The photographs, dating from the 1932nd, show a woman bearing a striking resemblance to descriptions of Veronica Burke, standing alongside several men in white coats in what appears to be a clinical setting. The woman has a silver key on a chain around her neck. The researcher who found the pictures sent them to coworkers who were interested in the history of mental health treatment in the Appalachian region. 3 days later, the researcher said that the photos were no longer in the archive. He tried to open the digital copies he had made, but the files were too damaged to be fixed. He was told that he couldn't talk to university officials about the issue, and he was also told that his research grant would not be renewed for the next school year. The attic is waiting. The key moves. And in the Appalachian Mountains, a lone woman with gray eyes is watching, choosing, and inviting. The method goes on. The pattern changes. And those who see it too clearly become part of it. Their voices are silenced. Their discoveries are lost. Their warnings are ignored. And no one has the courage or the means to end what Veronica Burke started, closing the attic door and throwing away the silver key that opens it. People will keep going missing. The terror will go on. The mountains will keep their darkest secret. What happens to people who climb the stairs to the attic and find out too late that some doors can never really be closed once they are opened?